Do hypothetical questions make you anxious? Do you find it difficult in the moment to come up with the right solutions? What if you could implement one simple trick that would really help you in the solution portion of these hypothetical answers? One of the key tips and tricks is you are likely not using past examples as fuel for your solutions. Specifically, the secondary definition of fuel is to support or stimulate. And that's exactly what we are going to talk about in this video. We are interviewing for this specific position for a reason. So the likelihood that you've been through something similar is very high. So why not in your mind at least correlate the solution back to actual experience? It will make solving these tough open-ended questions much easier. So let's talk about it. Later in this video, I'm going to share my screen and to show you how to practically apply this concept specifically by utilizing your cheat sheet. And then at the end of this video, we'll briefly talk about what happens if they actually call you out. Item 1, take your time. This approach will only work well if you slow down. The instant you hear this question, ask yourself, have I been through something similar in the past? Then, after writing the question down and restating if necessary, simply tell your interviewer, I'm going to take a minute to gather my thoughts. During this minute, you will take your time to reference your cheat sheet and speed up your processing. Item number 2 is the CFAS method. So now that we have this previous example in mind and we're utilizing our cheat sheet, we're going to go through each one of these steps. Specifically, we want to focus in on the clarification, framework, and assumptions, and then we'll dive deeper into the solution. So what if we use our example to fuel each one of these specific items? Your clarifying questions can be focused around questions that you asked during that specific initiative. Now, you can absolutely use your pre-planned clarifying questions, but you might create a nuanced question or two referring back to your example. Then, the framework can be focused in on those critical concepts that you needed to utilize to solve the scenario you were in. And you can pick the framework concept to start with that was most challenging for you during your journey when you did it, like diving deep into the data, working with critical stakeholders, etc. Next is your assumptions. And the assumptions, there's a few critical items to keep in mind. When you transition into your assumptions, you need to say, let's assume, because you've already had this experience. So sometimes we just won't use the right words. And then we also want to tie it back to the question and the role we're interviewing for. Sometimes we get so fixated on our example, we forget to make it specific to the question and specific to the role and company. Lastly, I have helped my clients by utilizing this strategy, but sometimes the assumptions come across as so specific that clearly they're using an example. So I want it to be specific, but generic enough that it doesn't seem like you're using an example. Then, when you solve, remember these key items. And I know I'm getting repetitive. I'm being repetitive for a reason. Solve wearing the hat of the role. Use your past experience as fuel and make it nuanced to the position and organization. That is really going to help you differentiate from actually just giving an example to making it sound like you're problem solving. Item 3 is our cheat sheet. So we're going to dive in and do a screen share. I want to imagine that I'm interviewing for a technical recruiter position at LinkedIn, and we're always, as always, working with our trusty interviewer, Sue. And Sue asked me the question, Jeff, what steps would you take to enhance the candidate experience at LinkedIn? Sue, just to restate, you want me to tell you about the steps I'd take to enhance the candidate experience at LinkedIn. We're going to assume that Sue just acknowledges us. We're going to say, okay, Sue, I'm going to take a minute to gather my thoughts. So now we're going to dive into the screen share. Okay, welcome to our cheat sheet. So for the purpose of this video, so I could screen share, I upped the sizing to 15 font, but normally you'd want this to be pretty small font. Remember, this is something that you would print out and have on your desktop. Now, if you're going to use examples as fuel, maybe you print out multiple cheat sheets and you just kind of run through them, but this is what it would look like. You are going to write down your go-to clarifying questions, some go-to frameworks that you might use, Some go-to assumptions that you might be able to use, and you can see the candidate experience one is the top one because it's an assumption that I would use interviewing as a recruiter. And then your behavioral examples. Now on a regular cheat sheet, you probably want to have 7 to 10 titles of your best behavioral examples, but I kept it lean for this purpose. So now what I want to do is I want to flip over and show you, if we got this question, how would we use these items? And what I also want to do, and this is kind of an advanced tip, is I want you to think about stopwatching yourself. If you're going to tell Sue that you're going to take a minute to think through it, then you want to really capture that minute. So let's say that we just told Sue we want to take a minute. Let's start this clock. So I went ahead and pre-highlighted these, but you could see my clarifying questions, my go-tos really do work, right? Has a similar program, project, or initiative been done in the past? Can you tell me more about what stage of the process we're in? The timeline to complete, and then the size and scope. So I would just stick with these clarifying questions. Then I would dive into my frameworks and I'd say, well, I definitely want to know the goals and objectives and historical data. Timeline and resources would be critical. Scope and scale and stakeholders would be critical. But then I'd also want to be thinking about overall scalability in training and development. Now, I've pre-worked these assumptions because this is a very common question for a technical recruiter. So I would just be thinking about, okay, overall candidate experience, global scale, and implementation into training. And then I'd go back and I'd say, all right, I've done this before. Where should I start? It's probably at the top of this operational place. Maybe let's start with historical data. So I'm at about 58 seconds, and then I could dive in and I would transition and go ahead and tell Sue, these are the clarifying questions that I want to ask. So I'd roll through these clarifying questions. I'd roll through this framework. Then I would focus in on and say, hey, Sue, I think we should start with historical data, but is there another area you'd want to focus in on? Then I'd bring in these assumptions and say, well, let's assume that we are looking to build candidate experience on a global scale, and that the goal and ultimate goal is to bring that implementation into training. If we were to start by looking at historical data, then you really start to use that past experience as fuel. You talk about what you did in regards to, and in my specific case, I would talk about what I did in order to gather all the data for candidate experience and really start to build my case. Then when I get to the end, this is where we come and we transition back in 2 separate ways. So we come back here and we tell Sue, I could dive much deeper into the data, but a logical next step might be to focus in on talking about how we involve the critical stakeholders. Where should we go next? So you're continuing to use this cheat sheet to work as fuel to help you answer the question. And this will be the critical aspect to really helping you solve for this type of answer, again, using an example as fuel. Okay, item 4, the call out. The likelihood that your interviewer says, it sounds like you've done this before, is extremely small. But if they do, you would simply say, absolutely. I did have the opportunity to do something similar in the past, but I really wanted to provide an example for how to cater and do it at LinkedIn. So you're not trying to hide the fact that you actually have done something similar. And while I didn't get into the weeds of how I would specifically do it for LinkedIn during my screen share, we might add in some nuances of how we might utilize the online platform, LinkedIn's online platform, to really enhance the candidate experience, etc. So you'd be adding these little nuanced items that were role and organization specific, but still kind of following the steps that you had in your example. Good luck.